Okay, so in this video, I'm going to go over the concept of the treadmill of consumption. And these are kind of the overarching questions here. Does consumption lead to happiness? What is the treadmill of consumption? What processes contribute to the treadmill of consumption? And how can we avoid being subject to this treadmill of consumption? And so this is based largely on the reading that was posted, short reading. That's a summary of the treadmill of consumption from the guy who basically came up with the concept in the 1990s. M.M. Bell is his name, and he's an environmental sociologist, so he's a really well-regarded, well-known expert in environmental sociology. And so one thing that he mentions is he starts off with the connection between income and happiness, and this is something we've looked at before when we went over quality of life indices. But if you look at these two charts, you may not be able to see them perfectly, but in this chart, this is income, okay, this is income per person on the x-axis, and then happiness on the y-axis. And you can see this sort of, it looks a lot like this trend here, okay? And this is income, so we've actually looked at this chart before. This is income on the x here, and this is your happy life years, okay? So happiness, basically, right? And you can see these are all, again, are all countries, and you can see the trends in both of these charts are pretty similar. It looks like basically at low levels, so if you increase income to a moderate extent at low levels, right? So you go from a couple $1,000s a year to, like, let's say $20,000 a year. Happiness does tend to increase pretty dramatically at low income levels. Same thing here, okay? But then once you reach past a certain point, let's say around $30,000 a year or so, and these numbers are all, don't take these as, the Bible, but the general trend here is pretty clear. Once you reach past a certain level, more income tends to not really increase happiness too much. So in other words, the chart really levels off over here, and it levels off over here. And that's pretty consistent. I mean, that's pretty consistently found when you do look at the numbers for happiness and income. Low levels, you probably have a really strong positive relationship. Now, again, you can have a low income and be pretty happy. Like you look at Ghana on this chart here, one of the happiest countries in the world, very low income. Okay, but generally speaking, more money gets you a little bit more happiness. But then after a certain point, more money doesn't buy you more happiness, and that's pretty consistent. And in the article, he mentions that the percent of happy Americans peaked in 1957, but our economy has consistently grown significantly since that point in time. And so, again, there's something, the point here is that there's something other, it appears, there's something other than just income and possessions and wealth in general that contribute to happiness. And we talked about that when we went over quality of life. But again, this is just to sort of reiterate that point, and it relates closely to what we're, the treadmill of consumption here. Okay, so let's talk about the treadmill. So the treadmill of consumption, if you haven't had a chance to look at the graphic that he has in the reading, it's pretty illustrative. So I'm going to leave it to you to kind of look through that. But the way the treadmill works is there's a couple of mechanisms. The first one is what's known as keeping up with the Joneses. Okay, so the keeping up with the Joneses it's a commonly known concept. You've probably heard of it before. So the principle here is that whether consciously or subconsciously, you tend to sort of notice what other people have, what other people, the fashions that they're wearing, the sizes of the car and house, and the type of things that people buy. So it's sort of it's hard to pinpoint exactly how it happens, but it's exposure to advertising. It's just by virtue of walking around and seeing what other people are wearing and doing. So you're influenced by what other people have, okay? And in particular, the things that are seen as desirable in society, okay? So again, this is kind of subconscious or somewhat conscious in some ways, where you're directly like, oh, okay, I see that. You see advertisement for a certain, I don't know, pair of pants or whatever, and you're like, oh, I really like that pair of pants. I kind of want that. That's like one small example of what contributes to this overall feeling that, okay, I need to sort of achieve or adhere to these standards that society has set. Okay, so you're just kind of constantly trying to keep up with, in some way, sort of the latest fill in the blank. And that's keeping up with the Joneses. But what's particularly sort of deleterious about this process is, let's say, okay, again, you're trying to achieve this sort of standard of we'll say material wealth, okay, and then once you do achieve that standard, the problem is when you get there, then you look sort of at ahead of you, so to speak, and you see, well, I've achieved this level, but I can see these people there that are wealthier than me, that have more stuff than me, so then you try to achieve that level, right? And basically, it never ends. As the author says in the book, there's by definition only one richest person in the world. And even if you do achieve fabulous wealth, think of the Bill Gates or the Jeff Bezos of the world, and you're incredibly wealthy. The problem is, once you achieve that, you're kind of looking over your shoulder like, oh, now there's new people that are trying to keep up with me, that are becoming as rich as me, and so it still can, you can still fall prey to this sort of keeping up with the Jones mentality, in that you have to still compete in order to keep ahead. You have to continue to consume more goods, and that's keeping up with the Joneses. The point here is, you can imagine this sort of analogy of a treadmill. You're just running and running and running, and even once you move ahead, you still have to run more, and it's almost like you're running in place, because you never truly do get ahead. Okay, so you can never be fully satisfied with keeping up with the Joneses. And again, this is not like a heavy, socio-psychological phenomenon. Most people understand this process, and it's a well-known phrase, okay? That's keeping up with the Joneses. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism of the treadmill is this positional economy. Okay, so the keeping up with the Joneses is based on the positional economy. And so the positional economy just refers to the fact that you are concerned, again, whether consciously or subconsciously, with your position. Think of your social position. Okay, so in order for the treadmill to occur, you have to actually be aware of sort of where you fit, your position in society in terms of your sort of your wealth. Because if you don't care where you are relative to other people, then the treadmill actually doesn't apply. Okay, so that's the positional economy. So the second mechanism here is this, what he calls the paradox of the positional economy, that getting richer can make you poorer. And what he means by this is, as he says, the levels of consumption are constantly devalued as more people attain them through general economic growth. So the point here is, imagine yourself on a ladder, okay, so on the social ladder, right? And so you are above certain people, right? So there are some rungs below you, and then there are people above you on the rungs above you. Now the problem is, imagine the whole ladder shifting ahead, right? So if the economy grows in general and everybody moves ahead a little bit, okay, so you have actually moved up on the ladder, right? You've moved up on the ladder, you make more money, but everybody else has moved up at the same time, okay? And so if everybody else moves up at the same time, because again, you are sort of aware of your position relative to others, even though you move ahead, if everybody moves ahead at the same pace, you're consuming more, but you're actually not any higher on the ladder. And that's that one paradox, right? And also, as he states, you can move ahead but not feel any richer. Even though you're making more money, you don't feel richer because you aren't any richer relative to other people. And another really important point here is, even if you stay the same, so as inflation increases, which it basically constantly does, that means inflation just means that money loses some value over time. So think of it, what a dollar buys you now, and compare that to what a dollar would buy you, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago. So money, as inflation continues to increase, a dollar doesn't go as far. And so if you stay at the same economic level, let's say you're making 50,000 a year, and then you still make 50,000 a year the following year, as inflation goes up, that $50,000 is actually worth less. So you can actually literally be poorer in that your money doesn't go as far as inflation increases. And if you make, so let's say your income goes up, but it goes up less than inflation, than the inflation rate, then you can make more money, but actually your money will go won't go as far as it did previously. All of this sort of just indicates that you can actually make more money and not feel any richer or not be any richer. Okay, so that's the second mechanism of this positional economy. Okay, and generally speaking, at the end of the day, more consumption of goods does not result in more happiness, and that's really the definition, the treadmill of consumption, as Bell defines in his reading. And that is, the treadmill of consumption is moving ahead materially without additional satisfaction. So those two mechanisms, the keeping up with the Jones, where you consume more and more and more, and yet you're not any happier because there's always someone ahead of you. And secondly, as the overall economy increases, even if your income increases, you can stay the same sort of social or consumption position in society. So you can actually make more money, consume more goods, and yet not be any wealthier relative to other people. Okay, and so that's sort of the synopsis of this treadmill of consumption, and just some related concepts: conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure, and conspicuous waste. You may see these terms out there somewhere, but conspicuous consumption, excuse me, is basically, you think branded handbag or shirt or whatever. So you have to have, I don't know, a Michael Kors bag or whatever, and that Michael Kors bag doesn't really have any much if any better function than a cheaper bag, but because it has that label on it, that's why people buy it, because it says Michael Kors or MK on the label. And this is not to pick on people with Michael Kors purses or bags. It's the only thing I can think of at the moment, but you can think of any branded t-shirt, or clothing or jewelry or whatever, watch. Okay, so people want you to know that they have something expensive. The same thing with conspicuous leisure, like people take these elaborate vacations that are, again, this is not to besmirch anybody that takes vacation, but it's sort of like a little excessive, and they sort of show it off, and they want people to know that they have enough money to be, take these sort of fabulous vacations. And then conspicuous waste, people that, again, they do, this is more of a like on purpose. They don't say finish a meal and they just throw it out because it's sort of a status symbol. Okay, so these are problems. How do we get off the treadmill? The big one here is, if you don't care what others think, you don't fall prey to this positional economy, you can get off the treadmill, right? If you don't care at all what other people think, then it doesn't matter if they're making more money, they have more stuff, and so forth. It's sort of that focus on intrinsic values, right? So that we mentioned previously, if you can do that, then you're not subject to the treadmill, because you just don't care what other people think. You don't care what your position is in society. You just care about who you are, and that's a really good way to get off the treadmill. And I don't know if you guys know anybody that's off of it. I know one or two people that they just don't care. In my experience, the people that don't get on this treadmill are generally pretty happy, because there's one really big thing that they don't have to worry about, is like, am I being really fashionable here? Do I have enough material wealth? And it's more, it's a little easier to be happy if you just don't care what other people think. Again, back to that earlier lesson on advertising and materialism. It's a it can or tends to be a sort of happier way to go about it. And so, a really important point here: how does this all relate to sustainability? So the two big ones here are, one, this whole process reduces your quality of life because you're not as happy. So you can think of the economy part of the 3 E's. The really, really big one here is that, as all this stuff we've mentioned earlier about modern economics and how it treats nature and waste and all that, as consumption increases, as consumption in society, economic activity in society increases, it produces waste, it uses natural resources, all those other things that we've talked about. So that's the really big one here, is this process It leads to environmental destruction, but it also leads to lower quality of life. So the treadmill of consumption defined is moving ahead materially without additional satisfaction. So that is the treadmill of consumption. It's relying upon the positional economy, so you have to be concerned, whether consciously or subconsciously, with where you fit in society, your sort of position in terms of your wealth or consumption. And so the two main mechanisms here are keeping up with the Joneses, and then the the paradox of the positional economy, that you can actually become wealthier, but if everyone in society moves at the same rate, you can be wealthier, but in relative to other people, you are still in the same position. And so again, it's this treadmill. You never stop. And remember, the treadmill's a really deliberate analogy or metaphor, excuse me. You just keep running and running and running, but you're not moving ahead materially. That's the treadmill. Okay, and so we can promote this, counteract this by promoting intrinsic values and getting away from this positional economy. But in general, to one of the last points I made, if we can develop sort of a steady state economy or otherwise develop an economy that doesn't cause all this environmental damage, then we're not quite as concerned about the treadmill of consumption from an environmental perspective. Because if the economy increases and you're increasing consumption, if we can develop this sustainable economy, then it's really not as big of a deal. And I think this is kind of an interesting way that he put it in the reading, is that not only do we consume more than we need, we consume more than we want. In other words, we don't, from a sustainability perspective, we're consuming more than we should, okay? But also, whether we realize it or not, we're actually end up consuming more than we want. In other words, we consume more than would actually make us happy. And so we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot in multiple ways, particularly from a sustainability perspective. And again, this is particularly bad for economy and the environment, but especially for the environment.